I'd like to do is just provide kind of a brief overview, and talking primarily from the Canadian perspective, but also being aware of what is happening elsewhere. Can I just do a quick count? How many physicians do we have with us today? Nurses? Social workers? Hospital administrators? Government ministers? You're supposed to laugh at that. Okay, I'm going to ask a question, and I do not expect you to put your hands up. How many of you have an advanced care plan? How many of you had a conversation about your what your wishes might be? Okay, so a few people have talked about it. Okay. In North America, there's been a lot of attention focused on advanced care planning. In fact, we've just had kind of an advanced care planning month. And having watched, monitored the news media in particular about this issue, it got a lot of attention. But the one report that to me stood out was about a particular hospital, one that took an awareness program, not among families, not among patients, but among staff. The belief being you cannot talk to someone knowledgeable about advanced care planning if you yourself have not gone through that process. And it's going to be very interesting to see what fallout the outcome might be. I don't know how they're planning to measure this, but their entire campaign, meetings, workshops, etc., are focusing exclusively on hospital staff. And that included everyone, from the medical director right through to maintenance staff. And it'll be interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't know whether they're going to be measuring that that exercise. But it seems to make sense. You know, you can't really, you know, preach something if you yourself not practicing it. Talk about patient-centered care. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. We're all familiar with that concept. And of course, the issue of patient autonomy and the right to self-determination, which is at the heart of Western philosophy, which is at the heart of certainly the North American healthcare systems in terms of the patient's right to decide. And this is often defended to the point of shedding blood because there's a strong belief, a very, very strong belief among many individuals that they have that right to decide for themselves without any consultation, without considering any emotions or feelings of other people. And time again, you encounter situations where a patient has been very clear, whether they're informed or otherwise, they've been very clear about what wishes are. They have not shared that with anyone. And when they lose the capacity to actually, you know, communicate their wishes, and the family becomes more involved, create this emotional minefield within the family. They may not have agreed with what their father or their mother had expressed. So one thing that we do see consistently, that even though we're seeing more and more talk about advanced care planning, seems to be a weakness in the idea, in the conversation. It's not always engaging health professionals, and it's not always engaging the family. We'll come back to that in a few moments. The worldwide interest is phenomenal. It's been an issue for a very long time, but I've witnessed myself through monitoring the literature and the news media that it's become a huge interest. In the US, it probably really took off with the Terry Schiavo case. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with that case. It was highly publicized worldwide, very controversial, even involved the federal government and the governor of Florida, sorry. It was highly controversial. But out of that came, the concept of, take control. Don't face the situation that Terry Schreiber faced. Take control, make your decisions, what you can. That seemed to be the beginning of a fairly consistent and long-term discussion in the media and in the literature about advanced care planning. Public education, I mentioned this now, we'll come back to it in a little bit more detail. This is an area, although there is a great deal of discussion, and certainly a lot of press being given to this issue, efforts to educate the public are extremely fragmented. There's still uncertainty as to what advanced care planning is. There's confusion with advanced care planning, the term advanced directives, and the term living a will. But what we are seeing is increasingly, more notably in the States, more and more individual states are enacting legislation to protect patient rights, to ensure that their wishes are honored or respected. And there are economic implications. I was involved in a study for Health Canada, which was a review basically of what was happening in advanced care planning in Canada and also in North America, the UK, and Australia. And the government's reasoning was, by promoting this, hopefully we improve the decision-making process. Hopefully, we will not tax our resources. They were not looking at it necessarily from a humane or compassionate perspective. They were looking at the cold, hard facts. And this is several years ago now, but it seemed to be at the start of the discussion or the open debate about aggressive care at the end of life. And a lot of discussion around the fact that healthcare is most expensive in those last 3 to 6 months of a person's life, particularly among the elderly. So, this is the motivation. We're seeing this in palliative care, for example. It is the economic benefits of palliative care that the government is really paying attention to. That is motivating them to do more in terms of providing, say, home care in the community. But it's not without controversy. There's a lot of controversy around this issue. I'm going to, again, explore that a little bit more. Advanced care planning, however, is most often discussed in the context of elder care and resuscitation and the refusal or withdrawal of treatment. It's rarely discussed outside of that. Although, and I can again only speak from the Canadian perspective, a person's first experience of an advanced directive is in connection with organ donation. Up until a few years ago, for example, every time you renewed your driving license, there was a little form attached to it in which you were asked to basically give permission for your organs to be harvested in the event of your death. And in a sense, it's an advanced directive. You're saying in the event of my death, you can cut me up any way you feel is appropriate. Okay, this is some pretty basic stuff, I appreciate that, but advanced care planning is intended to facilitate the decision-making process in the event of serious illness or incapacity. It allows a person to remain involved in their future care and treatment, even when they lose, particularly when they lose the capacity to communicate. But as presented or promoted, it presupposes a clear, concise expression of a patient's wishes. And I think from the discussion that had taken place before the lecture, that clear and concise bit is what is troublesome. Wishes that reflect personal beliefs and values. In the other lectures that I've given while here in Singapore, I've referred to a couple of cases in Canada that we're dealing with right now. And it's been interesting how often beliefs and values are not part of the discussion around decision making. We have one particular high-profile case right now in the courts in which, based on the patient's faith, their religion. They wanted everything done that could be done to sustain life. Evidence showed that none of that was discussed early on in the illness, or at any time during the patient's illness, until the physicians felt it was futile to continue treatment. Had that discussion taken place earlier, they may have been at least handled differently. The other key concept is a guided conversation with a health professional. In reality, this doesn't happen very often. And I'm going to come back to that. And a dialogue with family and loved ones. Countless examples, lots of anecdotal evidence that shows that even if someone has taken the time to think through this, documented their wishes, it cannot be assumed that they've been shared with anyone. For example, in my own family, when my mother-in-law was admitted to hospital just for life-threatening, she was asked, who is your substitute decision maker? My wife, Sandra. My wife didn't know that. We found out after the fact. But had something happened during that weekend when she was in the hospital? I'm not sure, I think we know what we would have done, but the thing is we would have been caught off guard because no discussion had taken place. That's pretty common. I make this point in all of my lectures when discussing communications, and particularly family, is that our Canadian national norms and principles of practice on end-of-life care clearly state the family is defined as those closest to the patient in knowledge, care, and affection. And this reflects the changes that have occurred in family dynamics. This actually originates from our early experience with HIV/AIDS, where young men were abandoned, literally abandoned by their families because of their illness. Their families then became their partners or friends or just other people sharing, with that same illness. And where problems occurred was when the HIV/AIDS patient was nearing the end of their life, the family came back into the picture. The patient's partner or friends had no legal status whatsoever in terms of decision making. And so the families started to take control, tried to take control of the situation. And often would be acting against the patient's wishes. The law has changed significantly in Ontario in the last 20 years in terms of protecting the rights of common law, and common law marriages or common law partnerships. This is how the public, and patients in particular, are presented with the idea of an advanced care plan. Consider, discuss, plan ahead in the event of illness and capacity. Makes sense? I don't think anyone would disagree. Name someone to speak on your behalf in the event that you lose the mental capacity to communicate or express wishes. And with an advanced care plan, health professionals will be able to make decisions that reflect your values and crucial wishes. Fairly simple argument for palliative care, for advanced care planning. Again, part of the concept or the idea of the value of an advanced care plan is that it can help prepare a patient and family emotionally for the illness experience and to better cope. This comes back to the importance of communication. It was raised by more than one, our own group that chatted, that the discussion that takes place in defining what wishes are. One of the most common things you will see in an advanced care plan is no heroic measures. What does that mean? Because often, as I mentioned earlier, people are formulating their wishes, if not writing them down, often without any discussion, often with little information. And as a consequence, they're not fully aware of what the options might be for the circumstances under which they would want this exercised. And again, part of the concept or the principle of advanced care planning is that it's less stress. Particularly for the families. What's the public understanding? But there's contradictory evidence. There's a confusion, for example, around terminology. I've referred to advanced care plan, advanced directive, and living will. And in some jurisdictions, there's a clear distinction between advanced care plan and advanced directive. And at the end, I'm going to talk about the situation specifically in Ontario as an example of that. A recent survey that was done, public poll that was taken in Canada around advanced care planning, found that most Canadians understood the concept, did not have an advanced care plan, however. But interestingly enough, the researchers chose to use the term advanced care plan, and yet the term most widely recognized is living wills. So it wasn't really an accurate measure. This is another, it's one of my pet complaints actually, is that the wording sometimes of these kinds of studies or public opinion polls that they conduct. Few people consider or make known their wishes regarding future personal care or medical treatment. There are a number of barriers. Many who have an advanced care plan or living will have not discussed their preferences or wishes openly. What are some of the obstacles? In part, it's facing the prospect of old age. Something that people generally don't like to think about too much. Especially if they're kind of under 50 or under 35 or under 25. Facing the prospect of living with a chronic or life-limiting illness. People just simply do not wish to think about that. Loss of control, dignity, and independence. Certainly as we age, we think more about these issues. Acceptance of mortality. And family dynamics. Among the changes, and again I'm talking from a North American perspective here, and you know, recognizing that both Canada and America are rich multicultural societies, so we have many different perspectives. But among the changes that we've seen in families is not just geography. The families may be scattered around the countryside, not living in the same community. They do not necessarily share the same values. I think you could look back to a generation ago when a family used to vote for the same political party en bloc. My father voted for the Socialists, I voted for Socialists. They even followed the same hockey team or the same cricket team. They just had very similar values. Not true anymore. There could be significant differences of opinions around divorce, around abortion, around same-sex marriages, around politics, etc., etc. So it's not quite the unified body that it might have been a generation or 2 generations ago. And there just is a general all-round discomfort within the health profession to discuss end-of-life care and advanced care planning. One thing I have not included in here is strictly a personal observation. Is in that word advance. Personally, I don't like it. I think it's a hurdle. Because the minute you talk about looking ahead into the future, about what might happen, I think that's a deterrent by itself. My attitude is, certainly when someone is beginning to receive treatment, whether it's a life-threatening illness or not, talk about a care plan. There's different stages of a care plan. I've already touched upon this, that you know, there is confusion over the terms. There have quite, in Ontario, for example, advanced medical directives and advanced care planning have different definitions. The other thing too, in terms of public awareness, we're trying to educate the public, encouraging them. Too often, the word decisions is used as opposed to wishes. Now we've seen the change, but if you go back to the period of Terry Shivo and in the years that followed that, the message to the public was, make your decisions now. Well, the response to that, decisions about what? You're looking into the unknown, the uncertain. If you've not even been diagnosed with a serious or life-threatening illness, you're speculating. And that in itself can be a confusion, if not a deterrent. And discussion is complicated by language and terminology. Even in the points and observations made by the working groups, the patient's desire to die with dignity. What does that mean? We actually can't, with any comfort, any degree of comfort, talk about dignity, give you an idea about the language. A physician in Ottawa, palliative care physician, made the observation back in 1970 that we have better be very careful about our use of the word dying with dignity. That was our motto in palliative care. It is now the motto of the advocates for assisted suicide. And he warned us, the physician's name was John Scott, he warned us in the mid-1970s that our language in palliative care, dying with dignity, will be stolen. He saw how the physician-assisted suicide lobby was increasing in its profile, and they basically took that language. So whenever you're talking to someone who talks about dying with dignity, in many countries, you're probably talking to someone who advocates physician-assisted suicide. So it's muddied the water, it's confused the situation again. People who are opposed to decriminalizing physician-assisted suicide are now using the words in end-of-life care, they're using the words living with dignity. It's an attempt to kind of counter public perception. This is probably perhaps the single most commonly discussed issue, resuscitation, and what is people's understanding of that. The media has done us no favors, nor have the movies, demonstrating how people are brought back to life instantly in traumatic attempts to revive them. And there is a perception, a wide perception, that resuscitation works. Not all the time, in fact, probably in the majority of cases it doesn't. But there's that expectation that it does. We're seeing a change in language. Do not attempt to resuscitate. Now this is going back to people's sensitivity about words. I'm sure you've experienced, you may have often reflected, if only I had said it another way. If only I had used another word. This is gaining some use. Allow natural death. Some people find that more palatable, less drastic, less severe, less final. Some of the challenges, it's not possible to anticipate how an illness might progress or predict medical crises. And a patient may change his or her mind. We heard that in our discussion before the lecture. And of course, there's always the possibility that options will change as medical advances. There's a widely held belief, that there may be a cure one day, there may be a new procedure, a new intervention. And there's that question of hope, holding out that possibility. And, as was discussed earlier, the whole question of vague language. Elders often do not remember discussing a care plan or treatment decisions. A survey in Ontario a couple of years back of nursing homes, 1,500 nursing homes, studied this question. At that time, many nursing homes required residents to state clearly whether they wished to be resuscitated. That information found its way into the file. But normally that was discussed along with a discussion about welcome to his nursing home. These are our rules and policies. You might want to try the swimming pool, and we have a bus service going into the shop. So it's in there with all of that orientation about the new facility. The survey that was conducted found that over half of the residents do not recall ever having given any kind of instruction. And when they were reminded of what they had said, I can't remember the exact statistics, many said, I wouldn't want that now. It goes back to the changing minds. So it's, and interestingly enough, the request of the nursing homes to new residents to stipulate their preferences around resuscitation, that request in and of itself is actually illegal. Under the Ontario law, that is not appropriate, it's not permissible. And it was a demonstration that not everyone is aware of the legislation. I mean, how well informed, for example, are physicians or nurses or other healthcare providers of the legislation? I think that's probably a fairly common problem. In the same study, and I think this has wider application, or applies rather in many situations, there are a few safeguards to protect those whose stoic intentions melt away as death approaches, as well as others who, for a variety of reasons, reconsider but forget their previous. I think there was mention made about how someone had always emphatically stated a particular point of view for years and years and years and years, and then changed their mind. Well, I had that among my friends and that, and family's first reaction is, oh, Dad's losing it. You know, you always said, all these years, he's always said, you know, don't do this, or be sure to do that. You don't allow people sometimes to reflect on anything. My grandfather, as an example, did not appreciate birthdays or gift giving of any kind until very late in his life when he declared to his family, you can buy me a gift this Christmas. Well, we thought, God, just lost it completely. So. Not at all. The old man had just simply reflected on life and decided, you know, that he wanted to change his mind. Simple. We are so quick sometimes. I mean, the first time you can't balance your bank book, you would think, oh, I've got Parkinson's disease, or I've got some other. And from this study and many others, elders are not getting the advice and the guidance that they need. And often that guidance and advice is coming from family who may or may not themselves be as well informed, who also may have their own agenda, if you like. I think one of the things we see often in palliative care is where the patient has come to accept the prognosis. And in accepting the prognosis, the family is accusing them of giving up. Which, as you can imagine, causes all kinds of repercussions. The appointment of a substitute decision maker or surrogate decision maker is critical, not to be taken casually. Someone you can be trusted to respect the patient's wishes and to speak for them when they are no longer mentally capable. A lot of assumptions are made. One often assumes, well, it's the spouse, or the eldest son, or the eldest daughter, okay? We've seen a change, as I'm referring back to my comments about family dynamics. Quite often it is a non-family member. But it is not a responsibility to be taken lightly. There's just too much anecdotal evidence to show how once in a crisis, substitute decision makers tend to err on the side of caution. And it takes courage sometimes, particularly if the wishes are not to resuscitate. It takes some courage to honor that wish. someone who is not in a hurry to get rid of the patient, but also not unwilling to let them go. They're all rushing out to do their advanced care plan. But when Jacqueline touched upon this, when do you consider an advanced care plan? Often it's when people are very healthy, you're very clear about what their wishes might be. Certainly a critical time is as you approach age, as you approach retirement perhaps. It's a good time if you're in reasonably good health to start thinking about aging, about disability, or the prospects of disability and serious illness. Without question, when there is the onset of a serious illness, particularly if it's a life-threatening illness. And part of the initiatives in the US in the reform of the healthcare system is to motivate physicians to raise this question. And if you've heard of the death panels, I think that's an example of kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the concept. The very idea, to many people, the very idea of starting the conversation means you're in a hurry to see things happen. I mean, again, referring to my own family, trying to get the elders in our family to talk about their wills, just their, to them, is like, we want to know what's in it for us. When you die, do we get the house, or do we get this? That's the immediate knee-jerk reaction to that. And I think this is, with the concept of death panels, and it hasn't been put to rest entirely. There's the Patient Protection Act, there's various legislation, etc., which is encouraging, and in some states mandating that physicians have to take this responsibility on. Certainly as illness progresses or personal family circumstances change, it's a time to review the situation. And clearly when prognosis indicates significant shortened life expectancy. But like pain management, it's a process of constant assessment and review. One of the problems that in long-term care facilities, in the study I referred to, is that they have in most nursing homes what they call a level of care form. And once that's completed on admission to the nursing, it's basically put in the file, and there it stays. And that resident may be a resident for a few months, but several years. And it came out in the study that those level of care forms are not reviewed on a regular basis. They use almost blanket consent. But what are some of the issues? Is the concept of advanced care planning oversimplifying the decision-making process? I have to leave you to answer that question. But I think, there is some evidence, that because people aren't appreciative of what can be a complex situation, are not willing necessarily to think too far ahead about the impact of an illness, what likely scenarios they may experience as the illness progresses. All kinds of little hurdles, psychological hurdles under that. And then there's a question of in the moment. There's just countless examples that when you're clear of mind and reasonably healthy, you have one set of values and ideas. But once you find yourself in the moment, it's a different proposition altogether. And many advanced care plans, many policies in hospitals or long-term care facilities, many healthcare professionals themselves, families included, don't see it as an ongoing process of review. It's not unlike a regular will. Clearly, if you make the will out because you have certain assets, you want to make sure they're distributed fairly, and you lose those assets, you review your will. Circumstances change. And there was a recent article in one of the medical journals about family optimism that gets in the way of decision making. Part of that whole discussion around hope. keeping alive hope or the possibilities of cure, at least prolonged life. And who really has the final authority? We have a few cases right now, one going before the Supreme Court of Canada, which is going to tackle this issue. We had a particular case in a Toronto hospital where the physicians made a decision that further treatment was futile. This was against the wishes of the patient and family who wanted to sustain life based upon their culture, their religion, etc. The case went to what we call the Consent and Capacity Board in Ontario. I'm going to explain that a little bit later. It said the physicians were obliged to follow the wishes of the family. Physicians have decided to make this an issue because it's something that's been discussed over a long period of time, and the physicians lost that authority. So they went to the lower court in Ontario, who referred them back to the Consent and Capacity Board. They ignored that, and on Friday of last week, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. So we are on tenterhooks around this issue. I think it's fair to say that whatever the court rules, there will be an appeal, and it's not by the government, it will be by the physicians. It won't end the debate. But it also follows, parallels rather, a case going on right now in British Columbia, where the court is hearing a case to make assisted suicide a treatment option. And there is a similar situation in Quebec. What does that mean about advanced care planning? If you stipulate in your advanced care plan or advanced directive, sustain, keep me alive no matter what, it may or may not have no value depending on the outcome of this decision. So it's a very hot topic right now. It's going to be several months before we're here. So if you check into Media Watch on the Centre's website, you'll be able to follow what's happening. But it will have implications. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in Ontario as an example, one jurisdiction. I should explain that in Canada, the federal government has responsibility in terms of funding, but each province is responsible for their own policies and practices, guidelines, etc. towards healthcare. As part of its Alzheimer's strategy, 10, 12 years ago, the provincial government developed a guide to advanced care planning among a number of other initiatives. So they were specifically targeting people with dementia. And it was a fairly significant initiative. It involved training facilitators, public education program, various educational materials, etc. But since then, of course, it's had broader application and is now discussed more in the context of end-of-life care. We have several pieces of legislation. I'm not going to go into any of these in any kind of depth, but we have the Ontario Medical Health Act, similar to your own. We have the Ontario Healthcare Consent Act, the Ontario Personal Health Information Act, and the Ontario Substitute Decisions Act. So we have several pieces of legislation that have a significant effect. And I've taken some key elements of these different pieces of legislation to give you some idea of what the situation is in Ontario. Patients must be mentally capable when expressing wishes for them to be legally valid. Wishes regarding care or treatment may be expressed verbally or in writing. This was to accommodate a couple of factors. Some people can't write very well, can't express their wishes very clearly in a written form. And sometimes it's easy to kind of formulate the ideas in your mind, and then when it comes to actually writing them down. So provision has been made in the legislation for verbal and or written instructions. Wishes expressed verbally override any previously written ones and may be recorded in the patient's record. Now this draws attention to the really important issue of communication. It's an ongoing process because there are situations where you may have documented your wishes, and in a discussion with a family member or a member of the care team, you've reviewed the situation and decided, no, I want this course of action, or these are my wishes now. And we've had situations where the patient has expressed those wishes to their substitute decision maker and not informed any member of the care team. So that's part of the responsibility of the substitute decision maker, is if the patient expresses any wishes that seem to vary or contradict their previously expressed wishes, they have to share that with the care. So it really puts a huge emphasis on keeping that conversation going at all times. In Ontario, personal care, advanced care planning includes personal care. Personal care is defined as healthcare, nutrition, hygiene, shelter, safety, and clothing. It's very specific. An advanced medical directive is concerned with specific medical treatments or intervention and requires a dialogue with a healthcare professional named physician. It's part of informed consent. Advanced medical directive does not constitute a decision if the patient did not receive specific medical information. It goes back to the value and the importance that whenever a patient is expressing that they fully understand what the implications or ramifications are, or what the repercussions may be. And the Advanced Medical Directive requires patient consent or the approval of the substitute decision maker if the patient is unable to communicate. We have a lot of situations, I was mentioning to Jackie, for example, very few nursing homes in Canada have a resident medical doctor. Quite often there'll be the scenario where the nurse may call the consulting physician to say, well, I think we need to change medication. Or increase dosage. Technically, the physician should be sitting down with the patient saying, we've reviewed your medication and these are the changes, and do you agree? It's given almost. The nurse will discuss it with the physician, often by phone, the instruction will come from him or her. Very little discussion. The number of times you can talk to a patient, maybe you've experienced this, and they're taking a blue pill, and you say, what's the pill for? I don't know, I've got to take it 3 times a day and see the doctor next week. It's amazing, even though in this age of the internet where we can access information quite readily, it's still among the elder population not uncommon, and they really don't know what the medication is, what the benefits might be or the side effects might be. Wishes expressed in an advanced care plan only come into effect when the patient is no longer mentally capable. And this is an issue because mental capacity varies. And a lot of people make assumptions. And in discussion with the healthcare team, they start sort of making assumptions, even though the patient is quite capable of understanding, comprehending, and making a decision. It's funny because there was a time when it was the family that was sidelined. The focus was exclusively on the patient. And now that's changed. The dynamics have changed. And I mean, everyone is trying to act in the best interests, which in itself is a pretty vague term. But they're all trying to do the best for the patient. Wishes are not decisions. Decisions require consent. The Healthcare Consent Act, the patient has the right to refuse or withdraw consent to medical treatment, including life-saving or life-prolonging treatment at any time. I think this was point made earlier. And another point was made earlier by the group. The patient has the right to change their mind at any time. But I think there are a lot of situations where patients sometimes risk coercion from the family who want to keep the treatment going, do whatever can be done to sustain life. Advanced medical directives or verbal wishes documented on a patient chart cannot be considered blanket consent. So with every new procedure, development, or proposed intervention, there has to be discussion. One of the things that we talked about in the other workshops that we've had is how critically important it is to discuss early on in the illness experience what the care plan is. Discuss some scenarios, some idea of what's ahead. Emotionally, it has tremendous value because it's helping to prepare people for the inevitable. Not that we're can always be fully prepared. Before treatment, care providers are required to obtain patient consent or refusal to consent. There are patients who stubbornly say, no, I'm not going to consent to it. Under the legislation, in an emergency situation, care providers do not need consent in order to treat. But they have to be able to demonstrate that they have indeed acted according to the patient's wishes. Consent can be for specific treatment or a plan of treatment. This is spelled out in the legislation. Benefits of recommended treatment or intervention. Probable outcomes. Possible side effects and potential risks. Alternatives or options. Likely consequences of declining or refusing recommended treatment or intervention. I don't know, I can't speak, for your own experiences, but research has shown consistently that some, but not necessarily all of these points are covered with the patient. Every patient was taken through this list. They may have a little bit better understanding and appreciation of what's ahead. It's part of the care plan. End up having questions answered truthfully. And this comes to another issue about the reluctance sometimes to take hope, to be optimistic. A reluctance sometimes to be totally honest. In Ontario, we have what is called the Consent and Capacity Board. We're the only province at the moment that has this mechanism. But basically, it requires an independent review of a situation. For example, it reviews the patient's capacity to give informed consent. There are times, a recent case, for example, where the family tried to establish that the patient was not mentally capable, contrary to what the physician said in our own evaluation. The consent board came in and arbitrated, and to their satisfaction, the patient was mentally capable. It's worked the other way too, where physicians have decided this person is not mentally capable, and the family has. So it's a mechanism for that independent review. It also considers requests from substitute decision makers for direction regarding a patient's wishes, or departing from patient's expressed wishes. So again, it's a third party that allows an opportunity to get an input. And it also reviews the substitute decision makers' compliance of the rules. There have been quite a few cases, where the physician or care team may feel the family or the substitute decision maker is not acting in the best interest. Again, it's an independent review. I've already mentioned this as an example of an advanced directive. The situation in Ontario has changed, and I mentioned it was originally you signed your driving license. If you forgot to sign your driving license, it was assumed that you gave consent. Now we have a central registration in order to get around the issue of presumed consent. lawyers and civil rights leaders are very opposed to any idea of receiving consent. This is a tool. I don't know if you're familiar with values history, but this is a very useful tool. If you go on the internet, just put values history, and there are many, many, many different versions. This one is from the University of New Mexico. It's an interesting concept, and sometimes it could be, it's the beginning of a person reflecting on their values, their ideas. It's a good beginning to what's become known as a conversation. A lot of the advanced care planning campaigns right now are talking about have the conversation. And in fact, when this material gets posted on the center's website, it will be the PowerPoint annotated, plus the video, plus a list of references and resources. You will see in the literature a lot of discussion about this. I wrote an article recently, for example, and this article will be included in the recommended reading, where the two most important things is the conversation, to start that conversation. Secondly, the most important thing is to appoint someone to speak for you in the event that you are. You may not get as far as actually having a written advanced care plan. You take those first two steps, you're on the right road, so to speak. And in fact, the campaign in the US was around Thanksgiving, which is a major family event. It's the biggest public holiday in America. And the campaign there was that while you've got the family together for dinner for Thanksgiving, talk about end-of-life care. I'm not sure I would want to, have a dinner and invite people and make that the topic of conversation, but I think we'll put them off their meal. As I say, appointing the substitute decision maker is critical. Again, the concept of advanced care planning has some very legitimate aims or objectives. Above all, is to effect a change in the illness experience. But it hinges critically on that dialogue, not just the dialogue within the family, dialogue with some expertise, expert rather, a health professional who could guide and talk you through it. And ultimately, it just delivers better health care. It's just as simple as that. It's like preparation ahead of time. It results in less conflict. It doesn't eliminate conflict, but hopefully it reduces it. Clearly, a more effective plan of care. It sounds all pretty basic, fundamental, right? But it's proving to be a challenge to actually exercise. And greater patient, family, and caregiver satisfaction. Few caregiver errors, less stress, few burnout and retention problems. This is the potential for advanced care planning, recognizing all the challenges that present themselves. The key one being the will to think about this and discuss it and share. Because going back to this concept of patient autonomy, there seems to be a little bit of a shift that maybe a person should not only think of themselves. Now, in some cultures, of course, it's more of a collaborative process. But in the Western concept of autonomy, we've held it almost it's sacred that you have the right, whatever you want to do, when you have the right to do it. I think we're beginning to realize the implications of that. One case that I can share with you quickly, a student, a nurse, been in the profession for many, many years, 7 or 8 siblings. Her mother was diagnosed with a serious illness. The family knew she was not well. They were aware she was on medication. They were aware that she was seeing a specialist. But she chose not to discuss her illness in any detail. In retrospect, to protect the family. Her illness took a sudden turn for the worse, literally over a week. Was admitted on Friday, died by Monday. And the way that my student described this, and this is a woman who said It split the family right down the middle. Because half of her brothers and sisters said, well, that's what Mother wanted. That's how Mother was, that's how she is. The other half said, without realizing it, she had robbed them of that opportunity to care for her in the way that she had cared for them. 10 years after the death of her mother, she is still grieving over this. She's very angry. And as a result, and some of her brothers and sisters share that feeling. And as a result, the family can't talk about it at all because it just leads to argument.